Now that we've resurfaced our model and we have clean topology to work with, it's time for us to start thinking about how to get this detail from our sculpted model onto this more low resolution game res mesh. And the process we're going to be using for that is a baking process where we can make normal maps. So basically with a texture map that gives some indication for how light is supposed to hit this model, we can give the illusion that this model over here has got the same kind of detail and quality level as this model over here. In order for us to do that process, we have to have UVs on our models so we can actually use a texture with the model. So if I just take a look at this model and go to Window and go to the UV texture editor, and we take a look, this is what I've got currently through the resurfacing process. So basically there's all these different polygons are sitting over the top of each other, and this is a big giant mess. So we've got to build UVs for this thing. UVs are basically going to be like the process of, if you think about it, your shirt or a jacket on your body, if you took that along the seams and you cut it open and you laid it out flat on the table or the floor, you can see how that three-dimensional object can be made into a 2D flat object. We basically need to do this with our 3D object because we need to take this into a paint program like Photoshop, and it gets laid out in a two-dimensional format so we can actually paint on it. Now there are programs out there that allow you to paint directly on the model in 3D, but for us to get this into the game currently with the technology that we have, we need to put this in some kind of format for a texture. So that's why we have to build textures for this thing. So let's start looking at how to build textures for this. I'm going to go ahead and put this at the origin of the world here, and I'm going to go to my geometry. I don't need this high-res piece from ZBrush anymore, so I'll just hide it, Control H to do that. And so now I've got my model here. And I'll just tap 5 because I don't need any kind of lighting information with this, just to look at this for building up my UVs. So the first thing I might want to do is go ahead and put this on the polygon menu subset and go to create UVs, and I'll do a planar mapping. Planar mapping is basically if you just thought about a flat plane and it pushes through the model, you can tell it which direction it's going to go. So you can see with my world origin little thing down here that's going to tell me this is Z, this is X, and this is Y. So I'm going to take a flat plane and push it through the Z dimension right here like this. So I'm going to say project from the Z axis. Let's see if there's any other options that I want to use for this. I'm going to tell it to keep the image width and height ratio so it does a nice square for this. So I'm going to hit apply. Before I do, I'm going to pull up my UV texture editor window so we can see what are the results that we're going to get from this. Okay. So here we are in the UV texture editor window, and I'm just holding down Alt, and you can click and drag and that pans, and I can click and drag with the middle mouse and that's going to zoom in for me. So it's pretty easy to navigate around in there. I'm going to hit apply, and it's going to push this projection straight through the model. So now you can see what this is doing. We've got this flat plane and it's being pushed directly through the model. And then these are the UVs that are generated from it. So we've got some controls on here that we can click and drag, and we can scale this thing out. You can see how that shrinks that down here. We can scale this way. You could scale on the corner and it'll do a uniform scale. Same thing for this down here. And you can click and drag on this middle piece and you can push and pull that projection around. So this almost becomes like a camera view window here. The other thing we can do is click on this little icon here, and it'll make it to where we get a manipulator so we can either scale, translate, or rotate. And depending on what you want to do, if we wanted to move it, we could click and drag on one of these here and hit undo. If we wanted to scale, you could scale this way. Scaling in Z has no effect because it's being pushed this way through the model. But if we scale this way, you can see how it's going to affect it. Scale this way, you can see how it's going to affect it. If we put it on rotate, click this manipulator here, we can rotate that projection like this. Okay, so I'm really just interested in getting a nice projection going straight through the front of this, at least to give me some decent UVs to start looking with. So if we painted a texture right now on this, and we painted some eyes here and here, and we do a little mouth here and some details for the chest, it would show up on the front of the model, but it would actually show up on the back of the model as well, because that texture, this projection that we're doing, is being projected straight through the model as if it's slicing right through it. Okay, so we need to get the front and the back of this character separated out. So I do know that we can double click on some edge loops, and we can take those edge loops and we can cut the model into some pieces as if we were taking scissors to our shirt and cutting it along the different seams that we have. So I'm going to double click on here along the neck basin. So you'll want to, anytime you split apart the model, you really want to think about where's the best place I can do this and have the viewer not really notice this stuff, because it is possible that some of these edges could show up and it might not make the model look so great. So you usually try to hide this, and you try to be strategic about where you place these cuts. So I'm just trying to select this all the way around, just double clicking on some of the edges, and as long as that edge loop works okay, I can get that selection. I'll tap 4 and I can see through the model, make sure I'm not cutting anything else. Tap 5 to go back to shaded. Okay, so I'm good. And I'll pull this open a little bit. We'll just leave this off to the side because we might do some more projections with that. And I can go right here to this little scissor icon and click that, and it's going to split the model. Now, some other things that we've got within here that kind of help out. If you click this little button here, this icon, it'll draw thickness around anywhere where you've got texture borders, anywhere where we split. So you see I accidentally picked up this little piece here, and I didn't want to split that off. It's not a big deal right now, but it works out well for an example. I can actually take those edges after they've been split, and if we want to sew them back together, instead of cutting, you can use this icon and then sew that back together. You can see I've accidentally cut here too because I must have had some extra edges selected like that. And maybe these verts are not welded. That's possible as well. So I'll hold that down, select that. I'll have to revisit that. But basically, now that I have this head split off, I didn't split anything in the 3D model, but I did split in the model over here for my UVs. So your UVs is something that's completely and separate and different than your actual 3D model. So when I say split off, don't think I'm actually splitting the head off the model over here. I'm actually just splitting them off and separating them in the UVs. If I right click on here, I can say UV, and I can select one of these UVs, just one of them. And as long as this piece is separated off in the UV texture window, I can hold down Control and right click and say to shell, like this. And it's going to select all the UVs in this shell that they're considering that separated piece. At that point, I can put it on the Move tool, and I can just push this off to the side. We'll clean all this stuff up later, so as you're building your UVs, you can be what do you consider messy. So you can go outside of the 0 to 1 range, this square right here. It's just whatever you got to do to get yourself organized. I like to give myself enough space in between pieces because now I can easily drag a marquee around the body or the head, and I don't have to do any of this selection business and then go to shell and grow that stuff out. The other tool that is kind of handy for this is if you just select one of the UVs on here, there is a tool right here for moving an entire shell. So you can click this or just click on that part of the body and you can move these things around. So that's why I want to get this thing kind of separated out in this manner. The only problem I have with this tool is it becomes a little confusing because sometimes if you click off, you can't do certain operations and you're wondering what the heck is going on. It's because this is still enabled and you need to go back to just regular selection mode at that point. So now I'm going to work a little bit on maybe getting the bottom of this separated out. So I'll hit F10 to bring up my edges, or you can right click on here and say edge. And I'll double click on this, and there's a nice loop around this entire thing, so it makes it pretty easy for me to select this whole thing, cut it, and then now I will put it on that Move tool and click and drag, and I've got this piece separated out. Okay, so I'll click this for selection, and now I can right click and I can go to face. The other thing that's really nice is if you lay out your UVs uh, efficiently, you can use this to make selections as well. So let me just try to get this off of here. I need to go back to this pick tool and go to face. There we go. So I need to be on here, right click and say face. Now I can select faces. If I drag a marquee over this, you can see I've selected this whole thing right here. So I want to do a different type of projection. This one is camera based, so wherever I'm looking at with my camera, if I put it on camera, it's going to do a flat projection straight through the model. If I have faces selected, it only does a projection just for those faces. So I'll hit apply. So you can see I've got that new shape right there. And with this manipulator, as you're using that tool for the first time, you can click and drag them, move that off to the side. So I'm just moving out to the side to make it quite a bit easier for myself to right click on here and say UV and make a selection around that, like that. So Maya also has some nice tools for relaxing your UVs. So this tool right here, you can actually unfold. So you just click and drag, or you can do relax. I think it didn't unfold and it didn't at least show it because it was pretty darn close. This surface is nice and flat, so it didn't really need to do any kind of unfolding. So if I do the relax, you can see that if I use that with the unfold, this is what you can consider as some messed up UVs. This unfold tries to look at the size of the polygons in the world, and it tries to use a mathematical description of figuring out how to unfold this thing the best way that it possibly can to make everything nice and uniform for the world. Like I said, this is a nice and flat shape, so Maya handles that stuff pretty easily. But if we get into things like the head, things will be a little bit different at that point. So I'm going to go back to selecting here. I'll try to get the inside of the mouth separated from the head, so I can just find some edge loops and double click on that and see if there's anything that runs well along here. And I think if I get in the mouth a little bit here, I don't like that. I do know that there are some tools within the new modeling toolkit that they have for selection that are really nice for, like, if I'm selecting an edge, I can select this edge. Oops, I'm going to hold down Control or Shift, sorry, to add that. Just tap once. And if I hold down Shift and double tap, it will let me build out a loop and still keep the parts that I want. So you see I've got this whole loop. I can go ahead and get inside here a little bit. I want to keep that. I'm holding down Shift so I can just keep adding to it. And I can hold down Shift and double tap and it grows it out even further. So I don't lose any of my selection. I can keep growing that out. Get to this point here, and I want to make sure I've got this whole thing mirrored on the left the same way I do the right. Okay, so let's look here. That's somewhere in the head, and we'll go ahead and use our cut for UVs, and then I'll right click and say UV and select one of those UVs there, or you can use this tool here and just click and drag this thing out, and now we've got the inside of the mouth. So let's take this and I'll move it. Just make sure I don't have any other UVs selected. See, that's my hang up with this tool. I push this, but sometimes it just doesn't take, so I might have to click it again. So let me drag over that, hit W, and try to figure out why this thing is just not wanting to move. It's not giving me my move manipulator for some reason. I'm going to hold down Control and I can take away from this. So let's say we drag a marquee on there, we get too many UVs, hold down Control and you can deselect from that. I'm going to move this over here and I'm going to do this unfold tool again and see what it gives me. Another nice little tool with inside of the UV texture editor window will be this little icon here that will let you know with shading, if it's shading blue, the normals are facing the right way. As far as if you're building texture on this, it's kind of viewing it as if you're looking at this polygon and you're painting directly on the top of the outside of it. If it draws red, it means it's inside out, and if it's purple, it means you've got some things that are backwards and some things that are facing the right direction, and they're overlaying right directly on top of each other. So let's take a look at this thing again. You can see there's some weirdness up here at the top, and if you use this relax and then unfold, sometimes it gives you this better result. So you'll have to kind of play around with that. You do have to be a little bit careful with this relax sometimes, but it did a pretty good job on that. So I usually try to let the computer do as much UV work as I possibly can, and then I do the rest, maybe the last 5% to 2% or something like that. But UVs is probably not my most favorite thing in the whole world, and so that's why I really want to make the computer do as much work for me as possible. For heads, I like to go here. I'm going to select faces, right click on that, select these faces for the head, and I like to use a cylindrical map for the head. So I'm going to close down this planar mapping, and we're going to go to create UVs and do cylindrical mapping. We'll do an option box, so everything looks good there. So let's just say project. This one's got its own manipulator as well, where you can click and drag this thing and close it all the way up like this. And if we want to do anything with rotation on this, we can go ahead and click this little manipulator. It's the same one as the planar. So we click that, and now we can start to click here and then rotate that a bit. So you can see you can interactively kind of see where you're getting that split. You want it to go directly down the center of the model, and usually it messes up the very top part, and you're gonna have to clean that up a little bit by hand, but it's not too big of a deal. So by rotating this, you can kind of get a good angle like that. And then I just usually take this middle piece and we'll shift it up here, and then we gotta figure out what's this mess that it made on top. So we can either work in 2D or 3D, 2D over here, 3D over here. I'm going to go ahead and select these edges. I'm going to hit F10 and then select from here. I'll cut those. These I want to sew back up. Not there. Like this. Need to zoom in a little bit to be able to select this one here, and I can sew that back up. And that's cleaning up some of the issues that we have here. So there's still some other stuff going on. I'm gonna right click and go to UV, and maybe that wasn't selecting for me because I have the modeling toolkit. I love that modeling toolkit, but right now there are some issues with that not playing so nice with some of the other just regular Maya tools. So it is a little bit frustrating at times, but you'll just have to kind of figure out if you've got this thing open. This thing's got a little power icon on it or whatever. You can turn that off and make sure it's not affecting things. So let's get these pieces, and I don't really know what the what's the cause of this mess that's in here, but I'll work to get it cleaned up and try to get it fixed up a little. So I'm just trying to separate some of these edges. If I click this and tap F, trying to just visually find where this problem is coming from. So we could use the UVs if we select this and then take the unfold and run that. I want to be a little cautious with that because we start to ruin some of the nice things that we had going on with the cylindrical mapping. If we run this, let's just do the whole thing so you can see what happens. If we unfold this, it'll do something like this, which is, it's not horrible, but I do like this nice flat edge along the back part of the head like this. I do like the layout of this where you can see the eyes and things like that. So you might be able to select portions of this and then unfold just slightly. You don't have to run it at the full strength of the tool. So if you click on this here, you can unfold and click and then drag just a little bit. And let's say this thing does that, okay? It's nice. But we don't want this sticking out here like that. So I'm going to put it on scale. I'll scale that in a little bit. Maybe deselect these things, scale it in. Deselect that, scale it in. The other tool that we've got that is pretty nice at this stage, if we want to retain this outer border, if you go to polygons, there's a relax. You can go to the option box for that. And then I'm going to say pin UV border, so this border will stay, it'll pin and it won't move. And then we can also say pin UVs. We want to pin unselected UVs because we don't want this operation to run on all these UVs over here that are not what we care about. So pin unselected. This is kind of like the unfold, where it looks at the polygon size in the world and tries to relax this stuff based off of the scale of that. And you can do maximum iterations, 10s as strong as it possibly can be, and you can drop that down a little bit. You can hit apply, and you can see how it starts to relax this stuff out. Gets it looking a little better. So if we started using a checkered texture with this, we could see how the texture is stretching over that, and that'll probably be what I do next. I'm just going to get a checkered texture and load over the top of this because it makes it a lot easier for you to understand what's going on with the UVs at that point. Over here in Photoshop, we're going to go to File, New, and I'm just going to make a document, and I'll just make it, I'll go 1024 by 1024, like this. And I get it Control R, and I'm going to build a ruler here, drag out from here, and it should snap right in the center, like right around 512 by 512. I'm going to click and drag here, like this as well. And I'm going to make a new layer, and basically I'm going to build this checkered pattern. So I'll tap M for my marquee tool. I might have to click and drag out here to do the square one. So I can just click and drag out with these guides. It'll snap right there to that. I can hold down Shift to add, click and drag out, and I'll make this right here like that. And I'm going to fill this thing with black. So I'm going to click on the foreground color, drop down here, hit OK. And if I want to fill with this, the hotkey for that is Alt backspace. If I want to fill with this one, Control backspace. So we've got this texture pattern. I'm going to select all. I'm going to do a Control Shift C, and that will do a copy merged. And I can hit Control V, and that'll paste. So I've got this new piece right here, like this. Let me hide that real quick. I can take this and make this, I'll make it 50% gray. So I'll click on this part here, drag right around here, and change this to 50. And I'll hit Alt backspace to fill that background part. And then maybe I want this just to be a little bit darker, so I can drag this down and get enough contrast in there. So I'll make it 25% opacity. Oops, let's type in 25 right there, like that. And if I put this new piece on, if we do multiply, we can make this even darker, like that. But what I'm going to do is scale this thing down. I'm going to hit Control T, and that goes and puts me in the transform mode. And I can do my pivot point. I want to scale it from this left corner. If I drag from this corner and hold down Shift, I can constrain the scaling of this. So I'll scale that down, and I want this thing to be exactly 50%. So I can turn on this little lock icon right here and say 50%, hit Enter, and now we've got our checker pattern that's getting a little more detail in there. So I could drop back the opacity of this as well and just make this a little bit darker. Let's do 12.5, right around there, like that. And I could take this copy, drag it down, make a new copy of this, put it on V for my move tool, and then move it over. And I've got this section, and I can hit Control E, and then I'll merge that down right there like that. And I can make a new copy of this and put it on V for move, which is this guy right up here. And now I've got this other copy here. I'll hit Control E to merge that down. Now if I want a little more fidelity within this whole thing as far as squares, I can take this whole thing that we just made, drag down a new copy of that, hit Control T, and do that same process. Make our pivot point up here, drag the corner, hold down Shift, and then I'll make sure it's 50%, hit enter like that. Now I can take my opacity of this and drag it down just ever so slightly, just so we can see some kind of shift within there. So maybe it's about 25%, like that. Drag out another copy, and I'll do that same process that I did earlier, where I'm dragging out these copies, merge it down, make a new copy of that top part. I'm going to go back. I was off just a little bit with this movement. I need to make sure it kind of snaps there. Hit Control E, make a copy, and drag that down. There we go. Hit Control E, and I'll just hit Control H to hide my guides. Tap F again. I'm gonna get rid of my rulers. Control R. So this will become the texture that we use inside of Maya to check out any kind of texture stretching. So I'm going to tap F and just get out of this mode here that we're looking at the image, and we'll go ahead and save this as a target file. So Control Shift S, we'll do the save as. You can go up here and in File and find that. And I'm going to navigate out to an area for this where I'm looking at my resources, and I should probably make a new folder called Source Images, like this. That's kind of what Maya expects. I'll go into the source images and just call this UV checker, like that. And I will also put this on a target file format and hit save. This is not a 32-bit image. If it was 32-bit image, it would have alpha in the channels section. So we'll just hit OK for 24-bit. For that, and then save that out, and then we're gonna go on over to Maya and load that inside of Maya. So in order to get that texture on our model, we're gonna take a look at the material that we currently have assigned to this. I've got some history. I'm gonna hit Alt Shift D just to get rid of that history right now. So we can go to Window, Rendering Editors, and then go to the Hypershade to see the different materials and shaders that we have inside of Maya. Now I already made a blend material for this object. I'm going to make a new one just so we can assign this texture to it. So you should see in this area this Maya for these different materials that you can create. I'm just going to click on blend, and it'll make this new blend shader. You can middle mouse drag this onto your object, and it should assign it. The other way to assign it is if you have your object selected, you can right click over this and say assign material to selection. Now I can double click on this and see some of the options for the material, so you'll know it's assigned if you can start changing some of the colors. Like you can come in here, you can make it red, things like that. You can control the amount of specularity that actually sits on this thing, how wide the fall off is on the spec. So I'm going to get that texture on. I'm going to click this little checkered icon in the color, and that's going to bring up a new Create Render Node dialog box. And I'm going to go to just File for a file node, and then we can navigate and find out where that texture is. So I'm going to go back to this section that I saved this thing out to, like this, and I'm down at the bottom down here, and I've got Tools and Resources, and if you remember that Source Images folder that we created, I made that right in there, and I can steal the name of this UV checker .tga and copy that, and for the file name I can paste it up in here. If I hit enter, it's going to put an underscore because Maya doesn't allow periods for certain areas, so it kind of fixes that for you. If I want to see that texture on my model, I have to go into the texture mode. So if I tap 6, that will show me with textures that you can see on here. And now we can start to see this checkered pattern, and it's pushed along our model. Now if the squares are too big for you, and if you want to lessen the size of these squares, at least the more high contrast ones, we can fix that as well. We can select the shader, and we can click this graph input and output connections. So here you can see the UV texture checker that we made is actually piped in with this connection here to the color, and that's just the same thing as, I made that connection in here. So you're just getting a visual representation of that. If I go to the 2D texture node and double click on that, you can see there's a repeat U and V. I could pump that up to like 4 and then 4 in both the U and the V, and that changes the tiling of that texture across there. So I think that works pretty good. The other thing that you can do with this texture node within here is if you double click on the texture node itself, there are some color balance things that you can do. So you could use this color offset and you could lighten the texture if it's a little too dark for you. If you want to push the texture towards like a color, you can make it red or something like that, or blue. I like it to just be this neutral gray. So depending on what you want to put on there, you could do that. You could change either one of these and push towards color if that's what you're looking for. But with these two, you'll have a little bit more control over exactly how that checkered pattern kind of reads. So you'll be able to set it up to your liking. But the main thing is just to see this texture going over the object. So you can kind of see it gets a little odd here in this section. If we click on the model and open back up our UV texture window, we can start to see some things about like where we're split at. So I'll select this window and then UV texture editor, open that up, and I'll drag this over so we can take a look. And again, I shut down Maya and came back to it, so I might have to set up some of these options again for what we were looking for. I like to see the texture borders on there, so I turn on this little icon here, and I like to toggle the shaded UV display because the blue lets me know I'm in good standing, everything's kind of facing the way that it should. And if it's red, I've got some work to do. So you can see that with the body, we've split off the bottom and we've got this thing in the body. You remember how I showed you the planar projection, and you can kind of tell in that texture now. See how it's just from the front it looks good, but from the side you can see how it starts to just push that straight through the model, and this would be bleeding kind of textures and things like that that would go across the shoulders, and whatever you see on the front is going to show up on the back. So we definitely need to get that those areas separated from each other. So I'll try to find some kind of natural line within the topology to split this thing apart. And this might not be a perfect process, but we'll work on it. And I'll use the modeling toolkit with their selection tools because if you remember on the edges, we can select an edge and we can grow that thing out just by selecting an edge and holding down shift and double clicking, and it should grow along that area. Now you can see how this this is a loop right here, but it splits into like this odd kind of pattern and doesn't just flow straight down. So that's why it ended here. So you'll have to add this and double click here to keep going. So I can keep adding to these selections here. I might want to hit undo. I think I'm gonna go travel up this way, up the back, like this, and double click all the way to the top here. Add these sections, and I think I'll try to work my way around the shoulder. So I'm going to kind of follow this up. I actually don't like this part, so I'm going to hold down control and I can take away from those points. I think I want to run it up along here. I didn't want it to hit in here, so I'll select this edge, run it up along here, and keep working my way around. Again, I want to split this to the point where I'm going to meet up into the neck here. So I've got this line made. You can see how I've kind of worked my way up the model, and this will separate out the front from the back here, and I'll go ahead and cut that. So we've got that on this section, and I missed this one little piece. That's why I like to have this texture border on, because it made it really obvious. If that line isn't nice and thick through there, then it kind of gives you a hint that you missed a section. So I'll try to do the The same thing on the other side. So let's run that. Let's start over again because I picked up this bottom piece. I'll just click here, go to here, and need to run it up through here. I'll check the other side too to kind of help me remember kind of this pattern that I built, and I actually am going the wrong way with this. I'll have to go here like this. Let's check that back here. Yep. So you can, I try to pick out shapes in these polys. You see this is pretty obvious here. So I need to make sure I'm running up that same area. And this went too far. So I'm going to click here, double click, and I think I got this right here like that. Okay, and then I'm going to run it all the way back to the top, right there like that, and check it. Okay, that's good. So I'll go here, right here, and went up here. And I'm identifying some of this pattern in the geo right here to make sure I'm going in the same area. Oops. And if you mess up, I'll just hit undo. No big deal. And so here's this, and let's take a look at it. So I think we're good. We'll go ahead and split that and check that line and make sure everything's working okay. So as long as we've got a split to this shell and then this shell up here on the head, we should be able to use that tool to separate things right here. So we'll just click on that, and you can see if we've done it right, we've separated out the front from the back like that. So this is mainly red, so I know the back side is facing the wrong direction. So I can select this, and I'll put it back on my selection tool just to make sure I'm not causing any kind of problems. And I'll use this mirror or flip selected UVs in U direction like that. And you see how it mainly turns blue, so we know that we're getting pretty close to having this thing be correct now. So I'm going to just take right click, select my UVs, select them all, and we're going to try this unfold or this smooth UV tool and unfold with that, see what happens. And it looks like it's doing a pretty good job. Let's do a little relax on it and then unfold. And if you keep dragging this out and it doesn't move anymore, it just means the computer has, you know, run that algorithm the best that it can. Sometimes I've found that if you know this is kind of curving around, so that planar projection is coming around the shoulder and curving quite a bit, and I'm surprised that it handled it as well as it did. So it did unfold it, and everything appears to be good on it, but sometimes this operation has a little bit of trouble. So if I ever see it having trouble, I would maybe take this whole big giant back piece and split this section off and run this smooth and then run it on here, and then you can join it back together. So if you ever split anything off, like if I go right in here and go to edge, and I'll select this and double click right down the middle of the back, and it's not letting me do that there. So if I need to do it here, I guess I'll do it over here. So I'll select this piece like that and split it all the way up the back. And sometimes I do split things down the middle just to hold that center line. So you might want to do that, but let's say we get this thing split apart and you ever want to join it back together, or you split this piece off here from the back, you could go through and just select those edges and you can sew them back up. So it's pretty obvious whenever it's really close together that everything works great. But if you have some distance, so I'm just selecting the UVs and holding down shift and using the period key or comma key to grow or shrink selection. I'll move that over with the move tool. If you've got space in between these things and you select an edge, it'll show you the corresponding edge that this thing will sew up to, which makes sense whenever we just split it apart like this. It's pretty easy to see. But you might have a piece of this over here somewhere, so that can help you kind of identify maybe where it's going to come together. But if we select all of our edges and we sew, you can see it's going to bridge that gap. So you're going to have to try to minimize as much of that gap as you possibly can between things. And I easily, like on this, we know we split it apart, everything should join together. I'm holding down Control and Alt, and I can drag a marquee and it zooms in really close. If I have it on my move tool, I don't even have to look at the manipulator. I can hold down Shift and middle mouse drag left and right, and it'll move it left or right. So I can hold down Control and Alt again and drag a marquee right there, and I can get really close. And after I'm done, I can tap F and it'll give me a frame all for that selection I'm on. So now I can hit 10 or right click on here and say edge. And then when I sew those things up, you know, it's basically getting the model back to where it was before. So you might have to do some of that type of work. This tool is not perfect, so you know, sometimes you might have to do this in stages, take a chunk, and then sew all those results back together. So I'm going to unfold this front part right here, put it back on my select tool, and let's take a look at the results that we got here. So we've got this part's done, the back's done, the front is done, we've done inside the mouth, and the head is pretty good as well. So I'll tap F8 or go into object mode. You can right click and say object mode, and we can just take a look at some of this stuff like this. I want to get back to the channel box. So here's all my history. I'm going to hit Alt Shift D. That'll get rid of my history. So I'm doing a lot of things to just check this model and make sure there's no history. And before I really space all the UV stuff on the page, we'll just check this thing again for any kind of weird stretching. And you can see the bottom part has a different texture density than everywhere else in the model. And if we look on the UV texture page, you can see how this is disproportionately a lot larger than this section, and the head. These are all pretty relative to each other, but this part down here is not. So it is a way of, you can cheat a little bit. Let's say you want more texture resolution in the head than anything else. You could select the head and you could scale that up. Let's get here and I'll put it on the scale tool, and we could scale that thing up, and that thing could be quite a bit bigger than everything else on the texture page. So now you see these squares represent how many pixels you're going to get in your texture. So we've got more resolution on our head now than we do, let's say, the rest of the body. And depending on where you want to spend your budget, that can be a pretty good thing. You know, you might really care about zooming in on the character and his face, and you want that to hold up. So you're allowing for more pixels to be shown on the face than you would the rest of the body. Now that can cause issues with seams going across this surface and this surface, but again, I tried to choose a split that was not that noticeable, right? So it's kind of a natural seam right along there anyways. This, it's really going to be hard when you're separating out like a front from a back portion. So I mean, we've got this split running up here, and that makes it a little bit difficult to deal with, but you can't avoid completely not having any kind of seam on there. So the last thing to do is make sure that we're organizing this thing all in the 0 to 1 space. So if we put a texture on this in like a game engine or some other programs, it's only going to see this quadrant right here, and it shows you the texture here. We do have the grid turned on. You can turn on and off the grid. But we need everything to sit with on that page, at least for like a character that you're only getting one texture map for like the entire portion right here. So we can manually move these things. We've looked at this tool here where we can just click on a piece and we could scale that, and we could scale the pieces down like this. Here's where I'll just move these things pretty quickly off to the side just to get them to where it's easy to separate them, and then we could start individually, one piece by one piece, start to organize this on the page. So I'll try and give about this much resolution to the head, and the chest to me is very important, and I'll scale that down. But we do want to scale in relation with the chest and the back. I think those should be the same pixel density. So we're scaling those down at the same time. If I go to move like this, I can push this right over here, and I can get my scale on that. You see the space that I have between them. That means I can scale this up more. And I'll move it. And I would be using hotkeys right now, but for some reason Maya's not. Hotkeys aren't working. I've had this issue a little bit with Maya lately, and I don't know why hotkeys just want to stop working. But so you're going to see me doing this, but you know, you can hover the cursor over this and find out what the hotkeys are for that. So normally I'm all about the hotkeys, but just not working for me today. So instead of fighting Maya, I'll just keep pushing through it and get this done. So I'm going to continue to scale. I did notice sometimes too with scaling, it kind of doesn't know if I want to scale up or down, and if worse comes to worse in that situation, you might have to use the scale tool and just scale it in one axis and then scale it in the other, but then you're kind of ruining some of that proportional stuff that you did. So if that happens to you, you could run this thing again like this, scale it down, and you could do the unfold another time and it'll straighten everything back out for you. Okay, and we're getting really close here, and here's the inside of the mouth, and I'll move this over. And this looks pretty good, but you really want to try to maximize as much of the area as you possibly can. You do want a little bit of bleed for pixels to go past the UV border to help with edges and making sure that those edges don't really show up in other programs. So it's just something to keep in mind. You do want a little space around some of these things. So it's like this piece right here, and I've got a little more opportunity to give that some resolution, so scale that up like that. And same thing for this chest and this back. Accidentally grab that, hold down control, and I can take away from that selection. And if I need to add to it, control shift. You saw I missed a little part right there. And of course I'm missing all that stuff just for demonstration purposes, right? So let's drag this over just a little bit here and try to grab this. Might want to push this with that tool right down there. And I wish there was a little more space around this shape and this shape right here. So I'll have to move this over as close as I can to the border and maybe push it up. And I think that's about as much as I'm going to get out of that area. You try to maximize the area as much as possible, but there are a few rules. Like I said, you want to have just a little bit of bleed around things. You definitely don't want things to overlap each other. And ZBrush, for some of its operations, it has a problem. It doesn't like it if like one of these UVs goes past this thing even just ever so slightly. So that's why I always try to give a little bit of space around this area, all around the border. And I think we should be good. So I think that's a pretty good look at how You can take some of these different tools inside of Maya and use this to create your UVs and do it efficiently and quickly. Make sure you're trying to make the computer do as much work for you as possible.